And the answer used to be it was always in the fall or in late fall, early spring, or actually late winter, early spring. Right now, most of the arborists will tell you that you can prune anytime. And the reason I put anytime with caution is there are a couple of exceptions. One in particular, some of you may be familiar with it, but there's a problem called oak wilt. And it's not necessarily around here very often. In fact, I don't think there's been any reported incidents for this for quite some time. But in the hill country, I know where my son lives down in Lakeway, they are prohibited by law from trimming their trees between somewhere around the end of February through mid-June, and then they can go ahead and prune during July, but they can't, and then they can do it in late summer or late winter. So there are areas where you have to do that with caution, and just keep that in mind when you're doing it. Like I said, we don't really have issues with oak wilt, but it is something that needs to be of a concern, particularly where you're at. Typically, I recommend doing it in winter or early spring, and the tree is dormant. You can see the tree structure very well that way. It makes life a little bit easier to get in and out of some of these things. You don't have to deal with all the leaves when you get through with the pruning. You just have to deal with the limbs. And again, after flowering, for flowering trees. And how often? I said it depends on the location and the issues. And that's one of the things. Typically, when you have a group of trees around your house, you're going to pay a lot more attention to them than if you have acreage and you've got trees out in the pasture somewhere. Although those trees should also be looked at periodically also. And so if you're going to be working with something that's around the house, you can take your time. You can get things done a little bit more cleanly. You may want to make sure that the aesthetic area is taken care of, but for most part, once a year is good. If you got something in the pasture, you may want to do a little bit more of a radical prune. That's probably a bad term, but a more aggressive type approach, and because you're not going to be out there that often. So just something to think about. And one of the other things is young trees do require more frequent pruning training, and I'll get a little bit into that also. Trees, again, can be trained and can be adapted, and will tend to follow whatever sort of pruning you've done to them. Okay, I'm going to cover tools, and it's going to be a show and tell. So I'm going to basically get out of the share screen. I'm going to show it to you. I couldn't figure out a good way to do this on. This is my first time doing it on Zoom, so this is kind of an issue with me. So I want to see if I can get out of this. Stop share. Okay. So now I'm back. One of the tools that I'm going to be talking about are the things that I think you should be able to use without having any issues with them. I'm not going to get into power tools because I'll tell you later, there's some concerns about how well you can use them, how well you can handle them. There's a lot of folks that I wouldn't want to have around my trees with a power tool. So anyhow, with that in mind, you're going to see that we have a lot of things in there where they have different types of pruning implements. And there's a couple of cautions I'm going to give you. Get to these real quick. I think everybody's got a set of hand clippers, and these are very nice. They work real well, especially for smaller limbs. There, dog, kitty cat. What you're looking for when you have a pair of clippers like this is you want to have a bypass, which means that the blade actually passes by the other blade, and it has a cutting edge on it. The alternative to that, which we don't recommend, is called an anvil type. And you can see where it's got the solid part right here. That blade comes down, and this blade over here has to be very sharp. These typically tend to dull very quickly, and one of the issues with that is it crushes the limbs and crushes the foliage as you're using it. So it's not something you want to use if you can. We don't recommend, master gardeners again are very big about this. Don't recommend the anvil type thing. That goes on for larger limbs. We go with the lopper. Again, a lopper has a bypass type operation. Some of them do, some of them don't. Some of them you'll get to have little gear paintings in here that'll let you get a little bit larger thing with a little bit less pressure. Just an idea to keep in mind when you're looking at them. Great to have it. I always carry these in my bag. One of the most important tools that I've got, especially for tree trimming, is a pruning saw. And again, it's just a small saw, got a handle on it. This case, what happens is this one drops down and it feels up like that. So it's like a big pocket knife. These are very, very handy. I probably use this thing more than anything. Especially when I go after the smaller limbs and things like that. It's a very, very handy thing to have. Again, get one hopefully with a folding blade that gets covered. You don't want to have anything cutting you. On the whimsical side of things, when we get into looking at especially trees that have small, and I'm talking about, small separation between the two branches, where you have a hard time getting a saw in there. This is, it's like a chainsaw blade with handles on it. It's kind of neat. But what it does is it lets you wrap around it, and you can use it back and forth, and it cuts the thing off without having as much issue of trying to get a full-size saw blade in there. It's kind of a neat little thing. They have them on Amazon. Another one's a buck saw. Everybody's seen these before. Again, if you get one, make sure you got something where you have a scabbard for it. These blades are very sharp and do some damage. And I can speak to that personally. Not too much damage, but did enough to make me pay attention to them when I use them. So those are the basic hand tools that I think you can be using. There are some, if you have some areas where you have higher blades, you can get a pole lopper. Again, it's going to do the same things. It's got a bypass agreement part to it. Again, they have extensions on them. You can get up 15, 20 feet in the air. Some of them come with the pruning saw blades on them too. This one has an adapter where I can change it back and forth. There's also some that come like this that have a power or a chainsaw on them. Unless you're really comfortable with doing that, those can be a real pain because the balance on them is not exactly what you want to be using to go take it down a limb, if you especially want to have some sort of accuracy with it. So let me get this out of the way. So that's the kind of the toolkit that I'd recommend that you have or consider when you're out doing this. Jumping back to sharing screen again. And I want to go to get down over. There's my tools. And I want to get to slideshow.
On the subject of pruning, one of the neighbors wants to know, I know that you specifically said that you can pretty much do this pruning any time of the year, but at the winter and fall are best. This person wants to know, when is the ideal time to prune a peach tree? This person is trying to prune for maximum fruit production.
That's usually done. I'm sorry. That's usually done before the bud burst on the tree, and which means it's probably going to be mid-March, even into April, depending on the fruit tree. Peach trees require, this is taking me off a little bit of subject, but they have a chilling requirement, and the chilling requirement actually helps determine when the bud break or when the flowering starts. And so you want to be able to have it happen before that starts. And so the peach trees will vary as far as when they become apparent, when that becomes apparent, when the bud break becomes apparent. I will not let me do this.
Thanks, Pat.
Okay. I'm losing my, and I want to do a slideshow. from the current slide, and it's not letting me do that. There it is. Okay, we're good. Okay, so we're going to get into actual pruning. And so one of the questions that always comes up is, well, where do you get all this information from? And there's actually a group, a consortium of professional and government scientific groups that get together, and they periodically put out these ANSI standards, in the American National Standards Institute. And they agree on what's the best process to be followed. And they put out a ruling, and then, well, they put out one of these standards, and then they also put out a best practices. So the information I'm going to give you is coming from basically from that standard and through the best practices that the ANSI recommends. So there is a background to this. This includes some of the, like I said, some of the professional organizations, the arborists and the other national landscape folks, and it also includes a lot of the scientific community too. So it's got some basis in fact, and so it's a good thing to remember when you're looking at it. The stuff I'm going to be telling you is basically all coming from that, and that type of information is actually propagated by A&M through the Forest Service and through AgriLife. So all this stuff is basically has a basis in fact, if you will, for me telling you about it. This is one of the parts if I was going to give you a test, I'd be stomping my foot and tell you need to pay attention here. And so one of the things that we have is, where do you make the cut? And so you have to look at the tree and figure out exactly what that means. And A is the bark ridge. If you look at the little pin up there at the top, it's got a little note, bark ridge. And that area, it's up in here, and you can see where that seam is. And a lot of trees, that's fairly evident.
Just a second, we're still stuck on the slide that says tools on this end. Does everybody else see Pat's screen? Because what I see.
Okay.
Okay, so the other neighbors are saying same. They can just see the screen.
Okay, well, let me see if I can get back. See if I can get out of the sharing. Stop sharing. Let me try it that way. Come back in. Okay, are you seeing the
we can see this.
What are you seeing?
Yes, we can see the tree pruning basics now. It's not on presentation.
This is the rules. This is where it now.
Yes, it's doing right now.
Okay. Okay. So this is the rules thing. This is the American National Standards Institute I was telling you about. And this is the basis for a lot of the training that I've gotten and that I'm trying to impart to you guys today. So just as a matter of course, the parts you need to know, this, like I said, this is the stomp your foot, pay attention. When you're making a cut, what you want to be able to do is you want to make it as round as possible and between what they call the bark ridge and the branch collar. And the bark ridge is the top part where the tree attaches, where the limb attaches to the tree or to another limb, or limb attaches to another limb. And it typically has a little bit of what they call a ridge. And it's the bark that's in that area that you're trying to pay attention to. So you want to make sure you don't cut into the bark ridge. And then at the bottom of each branch, and it's not as typically as easy to find sometimes, there's what they call the branch collar, and it's usually a slightly swollen area below the branch. And so what you really want to do is you want to make your cut between A and B, but what you want to end up with is as round a cut as you can, as flush a cut as you can, and you want to have it downward sloping. And the reason you want to have it downward sloping is to shed any sort of things that could accumulate on it. And you want to have it smooth so the tree has a better chance of being able to perform, basically heal itself. When you cut a tree limb, what happens is that the inner parts are exposed, and the first thing that happens is it tries to run some sap up there to compartmentalize the wound. It basically forms a scab, and I'll show you some of those a little bit later. But as time goes on, it makes the tree easier to go over and to cover that particular wound. So again, this is just another way of looking at it. Again, you have your branch collar, which is just a swelling at the bottom. You have your bark ridge, which is up at the top, and it usually has a little bit of a ridge to it. And that's where you're going to make your cut. And you can see they've done the same thing here. It's a diagonal cut. It'll result primarily in a round area. You want to keep it as round as possible because it makes it easier for the tree to grow around it. And that's where that's where the thing needs to be. So it's a really important part of being able to do the pruning without damaging the tree any more than you're already doing. Because basically what you're doing is you're cutting off an appendage, if you will. Point of attachment, strength of largely. Okay. This is another point where I'm going to stomp my foot. This is one where tells you exactly how you want to make your cut. When you're cutting a smaller one tree or a smaller limb, you can use your clippers there and basically just do it as a single cut. And for the most part, that works for a lot of things. You can use loppers, do the same things, and you don't have to worry too much about it. When you get a larger branch, you're dealing with weight at the end of the branch. You're dealing with potentials of not being able to control the cut as well. So what you want to be able to do is provide a cut that's going to make it that won't damage a tree any more than what you're already doing to it with the pruning. So you use a 3-cut method. And what that means is you make the first cut. You can see it's out here beyond where you're going to make your final cut. You want to put it out here just a little way beyond that, cut in enough to make sure that you're cutting through the bark and go down maybe, not even very far, maybe a quarter of the way or even less if you want to, into the branch. And then you make your second cut. Now the second cut may be multiple cuts, because what you're trying to do with that second cut is you're trying to remove any weight off the end of that limb that's going to cause the limb to start to pull down and tear. If it does tear, that first cut is designed to alleviate you pulling any more of the bark off than once you're started with. So if you don't do that, and I'm sure everybody's done this, I know I have, where I've cut it, and when I start to go take it down, the whole limb just goes and pulls all the bark down with it. This allows you not to be able to do that, or helps you for not be able to do that. So it's really important to be able to do it properly. Again, part of this is it also helps the tree be able to heal better after the cuts are made. I'm gonna go jump a little bit here. This is kind of an interesting thing. This is my backyard, and what I have, if you look at the left-hand picture, this is an Eve's necklace tree. I didn't tell you this, but when I moved into my house, I had one tree. I mean, it was a post oak, a beautiful tree. I didn't appreciate it very much, but then I started accumulating other trees. Now I've got 37 different trees with 24 varieties. So, I've got all sorts of stuff. But anyhow, I have these same issues that everybody else does. What I've got is this is a Eve's necklace. You can tell by the little seed pods up here. But what happened is when I put it in, it started developing what they call a codominant leader. And we'll get into this a lot more when we're talking about smaller or pruning young trees. But this is a young tree. It had an issue with a codominant leader. In other words, these leaders were both basically the same diameter, and they're all both going vertical. And for shade trees, you typically want to have a single codominant leader or single dominant leader. So you want to try and do something to remove this or stop it from growing so that you can let the other limb that you really want to have go up there. So I picked, that's where I want the tree to grow. This one's a little bit more robust as far as the growth on it. And so I figured I needed to take off this one on the left. So there's my bark ridge. There's my branch collar down here. And so I had to make a cut coming across this way. Made my cut, and then can't see around here. The photo on the right shows it that's after about a year's worth of growth, or worth of healing, if you will. And so you can see how this thing has formed some a little covering around it. That's called callus wood, and that's what you want to see. You want to see it completely going around there. You want to see that you can still see evidence of the branch inside there, but it's basically been covered up and the tree's healed itself. And eventually that will go to the point where all you're going to see is maybe a C and not. So it's kind of an interesting way to approach it. But anyhow, again, this type of cut is, like I said, is good for removing a co-dominant leader or any other branch for that matter. The same process where you look at it and you figure out where you want to make your cut. You look for your bark ridge, look for your branch collar, you make your cut between it, you keep it round, you keep it as smooth as you can, and that's what you should end up with.
We have a question based on these cuts on that 3-point method. One of the neighbors would like clarification on that first cut. They want to know if that first cut comes up from the bottom or down from the top.
Up from the bottom. What you're trying to do is prevent any sort of peeling of the bark down the rest of the tree when you go to remove nothing. It's down at the bottom. So it's yeah. And again, it doesn't have to be that deep, but you do have to get it through the outside portion of the bark so that it doesn't, again, can have a continuous area where you can just pull the whole thing down.
Thank you, Pat.
Help. Oops. Okay, we're going to get into tree pruning basics for young trees. Again, young trees are any tree that you can actually reach up into and you get a hold of. Sometimes there's even some of the older trees are small enough that you can do the same type of pruning to them. But one of the things you're going to find is there are they call X-current trees and D-current trees. X-current trees are Christmas tree shapes, and there's a couple of different varieties there that you have. They seldom need training. They may have a codominant leader. That's been my experience, particularly with bald cypress. They'll try and put on a second leader, and if you keep that under control, it makes the tree, the shape of the tree it stays with that nice Christmas tree shape that I think a lot of people like. But for the other trees, for other young trees, this is not the best to exhibit, but anyhow, what we want to do when you have a tree, you want to remove, first thing you want to do, and this is with any tree, is you remove all broken, dead, any sort of thing that looks like it's damaged, and put that to the side. Then you want, for a small tree, you want to select a dominant leader. In this case, you have a couple of questions. You have a couple of things you could be looking at, just like my Eve's necklace example earlier. There's one down at this side, and there's one going up this side. Well, this one looks a little bit better, so I would probably pick that one, and I would probably remove this one right here. And then depending on how old they are, you may establish the lowest permanent branch. This is coming from the book, and so this is what they want you to learn. You want to look at a tree and figure out where you want that lowest branch that you don't think you're ever going to remove at. And that's usually somewhere between 8 and 10 feet tall. So for a tree that's 6 or 8 feet tall, that really doesn't enter into the equation, but just to keep in mind, as the tree grows, you'll probably spend more time out and be able to do that a little bit better. You want to select the remaining scaffolding branches. You want to make sure, and scaffolding branches are the ones that go out to the side, like this here and this here. They're all out there, and they are, horizontal more than they are vertical for the most part. Sometimes they're up at an angle, and that's fine. But those are the scaffolding branches. You want to have them as radially symmetrical as you can, particularly for shade trees. It's very important that you have the tree that grows up and grows out. And if it has a bad side to it, you want to try and figure out some way to help alleviate that if you can. And then you're going to select temporary branches. This is another one where for a small tree, just about anything can be a temporary branch. And I'll also point out to you now, you see this down here, this is a sucker. And if your tree is suckering, the best thing to do is remove those two. What they do is they will suckers. They suck away the life of the tree, some parts of the growth of the tree, and it helps the tree go a little bit more vertical. Again, these little shoots down at the bottom are the same thing. I'd remove all of them also. For mature trees, it's a little bit different, and this gets you into some of the questions you get relative to, when can I do it? When should somebody else be doing it for me? But there's 4 different ways of looking at larger trees. And these are the ways that the arborists approach them, if you will. But crown cleaning is basically just taking out the dead branches. And if any of you had an arborist out, and particularly some of the ones that the better ones have a bunch of tree folks that actually get up into the trees, and these are the guys that really get after it, trying to get the the dead stuff out, move it down. I would like to point out that there is a process that just about all the trees do, and we always get questions from it on the help desk about there's dead limbs up my tree. Is my tree dying or something like that? One of the things you need to understand, there's a process, and it's called cladoptosis, which you don't need to know. But what it means is that especially with a tree with a dense canopy, it will shade out lower level limbs, and those lower level limbs will lose their leaves, and they will basically fall off eventually. The limbs will fall off eventually. That's part of the natural growth of trees, and it's not something to be alarmed about unless it starts looking like it's totally excessive and you get a bare spot or something like that, particularly if it's in the sunny area. But a lot of the trees will do that. They will have an issue. They will have a growth pattern where they grow up. The lower level limbs will start coming out. They'll get shaded out. The leaves will drop, and the limbs will eventually also drop. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at your trees. Crown thinning is just what it says. It's basically, it's usually done as part of your sorry, I go with crown cleaning. It's usually done as part of the crown cleaning. And what they'll do is they'll go back in and just try and get to basically head off some of the things that are going on to the limbs that are getting shaded out. They'll go ahead and take them out now as opposed to wait till later. It does a couple of things. It increases the airflow and allows the tree to be able to, move a little bit better. It takes some of the wind resistance off it. So particularly if you have a tree with some weak limb attachments, if you do some of this, it may help you save any sort of breakage you may get in a strong windstorm. So it's something to keep in mind. Increases light penetration. It won't increase it enough, especially for a large tree. It won't increase it enough to allow you to grow grass under your trees. We always get questions about, well, how come my Bermuda won't grow up under my tree? The light requirements for Bermuda and most grasses is enough that you're really never going to get a good growth underneath your trees. There are some hybrids, I guess, out there that will work very well, but I'm not too sure how durable they are in the long run. But anyhow, I don't usually try and promote anything other than the fact you should have mulch around there anyway. And then another good rule of thumb, and I'll get into more of these a little bit later, but never remove more than 25% of the canopy. It's always been that way. How do you measure that? One of the questions, or one of the things that typically I recommend, particularly for small trees, if you want to make sure you don't do that 1/4 canopy, is as you're taking the limbs off, keep looking at your tree, but also look at the pile that you've got on the side where all the limbs are. And when that starts looking like it's getting that 25% area, go ahead and stop. I mean, you don't want to have the tree stressed any more than it needs to be because of what you're pruning, the pruning area you're doing. Crown raising. This is something particularly lately, and I've got a picture of one late that my neighbor did, and he's sad now, but it's really a way of getting more access underneath your trees. And you'll see here that one of their recommendations is this 33% of the stalk or the trunk area to be removed. And so you have basically a trunk exposed down to 32% with the 67% of the crown. That's just nice to see, because there are a lot of cases where trees just don't look good when you do this. And I've got one in my yard, and if I went up to 33%, my tree would look like junk anyhow. So it does provide clearance, and this is something, particularly areas when people live in on residential areas, it's important because for flower mound, for example, our sidewalk exposure, you have to have 8 foot over that, and you have to have 14 foot over roadways. So it is something you need to pay attention to when you're putting these things together, or when you're doing this pruning, is that there are some times when you need to have a clearance, and it's really something you need to understand, because it is sometimes it is a legal incident or legal precedent sometimes. And I'm putting this out, but because it's in the book, but I really go ahead.
I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt here. This is a brand new neighborhood, so all the trees in the neighborhood are very, or most of them. We've got quite a bit of wild space, but ones the homeowners would be aware of. And just to let you know, that I believe, Tori can correct me if I'm wrong, but the last time I read the CCRs, and I don't believe they've changed, we're required to have trees in the parkway. So I know that most municipalities give some kind of period of time to let the trees mature, because if we tried to get up to the recommended heights here in this neighborhood, we'd have trees with 2 limbs on the very top. So I just kind of want to make that point that we would definitely not be able to do that here in this neighborhood and get that tree high.
Yeah. And again, like I said, it depends on your local ordinances and things like that. So it's really something to keep in mind when you're looking at them. You don't want to abuse the tree anymore than you have to.
Absolutely not. Thank you, Pat.
Crown reduction. This is one of everybody's favorites, particularly if you have any sort of overhead wires or anything like that. And it's designed to reduce the height of the crown. And if you have your coaster folks running up and down your roads, and you can see them out you may not have in your area, but you can see the damage that they do to trees. They do a special prune to them too that allows the tree to basically grow up around them, which gets you that donut shape you saw in the picture early on in the presentation. It's called a drop crotch or a limb reduction, and it's something that the arborists will do on a lot of smaller trees, or a lot of trees when they're actually doing a crown thinning to kind of promote lateral growth of some of the branches. And so it's not a totally bad thing to happen, but it is something you want. Is, I'm not sure if you have any overhead power lines there, but if you do, you need to make sure you take care of that. The other thing that came in with crown reduction, which I hadn't thought of, and I sat through a class the other day on it, was now you have issues with people with solar panels on the roofs. And, if you have a tall tree next to them, they're not going to be happy with you either. So, how do you, compensate for each one of them? And some people were off doing crown reductions, and it was probably not a really good reason to do it, but it is something you have to keep in mind particularly when you're looking at what the impact is to your neighborhood. So with all that stuff in mind, should you do the pruning? And the answer is small young trees are generally easy to prune. So if you have a new neighborhood, I'm betting you probably have a lot of small trees, and you could probably do some work on them to keep them growing and healthy in a good way. Larger mature trees aren't as accessible, and lawn ladders are not your friends. And so that's just something to keep in mind. Power tools are another thing, particularly if you're using them in conjunction with a ladder. It's something you need to be a little bit concerned about. So don't be too aggressive in what you're doing there. If you don't feel comfortable doing it, don't do it. Find yourself a nice professional, and I'll tell you a little bit about how to find some of them later. So if you're going to remove it, and so there's tree services out there. Tree services have a couple of different varieties. One is just a guy with a chainsaw and a grinder somewhere, and he's off doing tree work. And then you have arborists, and the arborists are the guys that are out there that have gone to schools, learned the stuff, to try and follow the standards, and try and do a professional job. And so it's a trouble. It's a fight to find some of this sometimes. I'll tell you how to find some later. But if all you're doing is taking down a tree, you don't really need to worry too much, in my mind, about who's going to be taking the tree down. Other than the fact that you want to make sure that they're not going to do any more damage to your property than taking the tree down. And so you can usually find those by word of mouth somewhere. But if you're really going to do some pruning and you want to make sure it's done correctly, and you've got concerns about what the tree looks like when it gets done, I'd find a area with an arborist, and they can provide a comprehensive tree evaluation before you do it, give you an estimate typically, and you can make your own decisions. So this is my shot. This is one of the few areas where where Master Gardeners actually promote another organization that has a commercial basis to it. And this is the tree prunings, and it's done through ISA, the International Society of Arboriculture. There's a handful of places out there that you can find. I'll give you the website if you want to find them. I'm sure Kim will share it with you also. And they are required to basically to follow these standards and be able to do it. You can do a whole lot of damage to a tree if you don't do it properly, and that's one of the reasons why we always recommend a certified arborist. So with all that in mind, here's some few little rules of thumb that I've kind of developed over time. When you first go out to go look at the trees you think need to be pruned, do a complete assessment. Look at the overall health. If there's anything dead or damaged, make sure you have an opportunity to remove that before you, and then go back in and redo your assessment. Check the whole trunk. And typically when we're pruning, we're looking up at the top. We never look down at the bottom. We need to look at the bottom. You need to make sure that you have an exposed root flare, and it's the areas there's no other evidence of damage. And you can see, and I'll show you some other areas for damage a little bit later. You're going to look for anything that's going to be an area of concern where you want to take it off. We've got codominant leads, what we talked about, cross or rubbing branches, branch interference with other trees or physical objects. And I'm talking about roofs or power lines, and all it needs to be looked at in its entirety before you start. And then you make your plan. Can you do it? If you think you got it, go for it. But if you don't, I'd contact an arborist. So the first thing you want to do if you're going to be doing it is you want to remove all the dead and damaged areas. If you don't want it, you want to make sure that the tree has a good opportunity to get around some of those. So once you do that, then you can step back and look again. Using the tree cut method, and I've said where applicable, because a lot of cases, especially for small trees, you really don't need that tree cut method if you're going to be able to take it off right at the trunk. And you can move up to 25% of the crown if you need to. And please don't go beyond that if you don't need to. It just makes the trees, puts a stress on the trees, particularly if you're cutting them during the growing months of in the spring or over the summer or anything like that. It really puts a stress on the trees as far as being able to account for all that loss, that food loss, basically. Remove completely or subordinate codominant leads. And codominant leads is particularly for shade trees is a big issue. What I've done, and I'm used the term subordinate because it is a term that's used in the arboriculture thing. But what happens there is if you can remove basically some of the tip area of a codominant lead, for instance, that ease necklace I showed you earlier had a codominant lead. And what I had done the year before, because I didn't want to stop the tree growth earlier, is I subordinated the undesired codominant lead. And what you do is you take the tip off, you basically disrupt its growth pattern, so it won't grow any taller. If you take the tip off, it's got an area called the apical meristem. Not something you need to know, but all tree growth starts at the tip. So if a tree is trying to grow two dominant leads, what happens is all of that energy goes up to both of those tips. And if you remove the tip of one of those, then the growth rate typically goes to the second one. And so that allows the tree to continue on with a good codominant lead, and you can remove the other one later. That's what I did with that used necklace. Hopefully I didn't scare everybody out with that one. Pay attention to the symmetry as you progress. This gets into the aesthetics. You want to make sure that the tree doesn't look lopsided. You want to make sure that it's still got a lot of radial area around it. And you spend some time looking at what it looks, what you think it's going to look like when it gets done. Pay attention to the clearance. You know, if you've got, especially if you have a lot of lower branches and they're reaching out over a sidewalk or hitting a building or something like that, you really want to be able to make sure you don't let them get away from you. You want to prune to enhance the natural shape of the tree. And a lot of trees have different growth patterns. Desert willow is one that comes to mind. It's really an interesting one because a desert willow, you see a lot in the medians and stuff, has a growth pattern that's usually a single trunk. But you can also grow them as a multi-trunk, and actually, to me, in some cases, looks better. There's other trees that do the same thing, and it's does it look better as a multi-trunk? Does it look better as a single trunk? I've got a rough leaf dogwood, which is another small tree. I've got it growing both ways. I've got one that I have as a multi-trunk and one I have as a single trunk. And they both look okay. But what I do treat them differently. Whether it's X current versus a D current, we talked about a little bit about that. One of the things, the questions I usually get is, do I need to, we used to do it where, as soon as you cut the tree down or cut the limb off, you came back in with this black tar stuff and put it over there to, to cure the wound. And that is no longer recommended, no longer desired, not a good idea, usually. And the usual thing I'll tell you about is, again, it goes back to oak trees and oak wilt. And if you have an oak tree, you might want to paint it, but you don't use the old tar type material. You can use a diluted latex paint, just something even like the color of the wood or whiter. It doesn't really matter. All you're doing is basically trying to keep any initial infestation by any sort of plants, or not plants, but bugs or things like that might be carrying a vector or might be actually be doing the damage themselves. So you typically don't do paint any of the trees. Around here, it's really not that needed. If you wanted to, you can, but again, don't use that nasty black heavy duty stuff. And make sure your root flare is exposed. When you get through looking at it, at the time, you want to make sure that you can still see the flare at the bottom of the tree. It's always important. And don't mulch over that flare. You basically give yourself a little bit of an area around that, and then you can do your mulch. So that's basically what I had. If you have issues, and I always put this in because people always ask me, what type of tree is this? And there is a tree identification thing website on the A&M website, and this is it. And it's really kind of a neat one because it also gives you a tree selection process. So if you're looking to put in a tree, and you can go in there and you can tell that you live in Denton County and you want a small tree or large tree, and this is the type of soil you got, and it will give you a suggested list of trees for your particular area. So it's a good one to know about. As far as pruning itself, there's 3 here. All of them are kind of a little bit different in each way. The first one has a single list basically of how you can take care of your tree, and has a bunch of different little things, websites that are attached to it. The second one's a little bit more expanding its proper pruning techniques. Again, it gets into the same things we're talking about now. And the third one's done by the National Forest Service, and it basically covers the same things, and they all kind of say the same thing. So imagine that. If you're looking for an arborist, we recommend that you go through the International Society of Arboriculture, and this website will help you find it. You can put in your zip code, and it will give you a list of folks in your area. And some of them are independent guys that don't do tree trimming. They're just educational folks that want to have this, or that they're certified. A lot of cases they are an actual business entity, and they do tree services, and they do have equipment, stuff like that. So there are some folks around here. Flower Mound, I know, even on their town website, has a list of tree services, and they list them by whether or not they are ISA certified or not, or have an arborist on staff or not. So it's a good thing to know. And then I want to give you another shameless plug for DCMGA, or Master Gardener Association, of which Kim is a outstanding member and is a really good point of contact if you want to get anything from us. But there's the DCMGA.com, and it has a lot of free form stuff that you can get through there. And then if you have a specific question, and I'm going to encourage you to use this, this is the help desk. And Kim's also on the help desk, so she has both sides of this thing covered. But this is a real opportunity for you for tree problems, or any other problems. If you have a specific issue, go ahead and you can contact them online, or you can contact them by phone. And I'll tell you right now that of the number, we always categorize our questions or that we get submitted to the help desk by, what type of thing they're dealing with. And probably over 50% of them are tree related. Out of all the other different topics you have, with flowers and vegetable gardening and turf grass, even trees have always been the number one thing out there. And I think it's good that people have that concern, because I think it's something we all need to pay attention to. They're a great resource for us. So now here comes the quiz, and I won't belabor you by asking questions and ask you to put your hands up or anything. But here's some of the things that we've seen over the past, and I just wanted to show them to you and tell you this is not, some of these are not something you want to see. Is there a problem? And so hopefully the answer you're going to come up with is, oops. Where is the bark, ridge, and branch collar? They've cut into that so badly that this tree is going to take forever to try and heal that wound. It got too deep into the wound, and I'll tell you that my next door neighbor, well, one that used to live there before that, did that to some trees, and I was really trying to get him not to, but anyhow, he got aggressive, and that actually damages the tree fairly badly. It's a setback to the tree as far as its growth. This is kind of a trick question, and you can see the knots. You can see where the callus wood is formed over the things, and this one's where they've completely shut. There isn't a problem, as far as I can tell, as far as what this tree looks like. If there was a stub cut, and there was a little bit of a protrusion of the old branch coming out of there, I'd say you have a different problem. But the fact that these are covering up nicely, and the fact that there's the callus woods being developed really well, really not much of an issue. And this is a problem. Other than the fact that they left their Christmas tree lights up, there's this issue with these stub cuts. And the stub cuts, basically, the tree tries to compartmentalize itself and take that, because the limb isn't growing anymore. It'll try and get back to sealing that off. But this stub here prevents it from completely sealing, and it opens up an opportunity for all sorts of diseases and bugs and everything else to get in there and to cause issues. So if they have been taken off properly all the way back to the bark ridge, it'd have been in much better shape. You can see the bark ridge here, by the way, and you can also see the branch collar down here. So they took it off pretty close, but they didn't really, they didn't get it back to where it should be, where the tree could actually heal properly. And this is, of course, everybody's favorite crepe murder, stub cuts. Again, there's really, there's not a lot of reasons. There's a lot of reasons why people try and do this and think it does a tree good, and it really doesn't. It's just something that sets it back quite a bit, and it really doesn't increase the flower fruit.
Back to crepe myrtles, we have a neighbor that wants to know about them specifically and wants to know, actually we have several that ask the same question. They want to know specifically about crepe myrtles. Should they trim those suckers? What about the dying flowering tips right now? What kind of strategies should they be using to prune their crepe myrtles and not commit crepe murder?
Okay. If you're going to take anything away from the crepe myrtle, you should do it down toward the base and just take it off there. And again, there's some concerns about rubbing, because a lot of these things do get up and they start twisting and turning, and it does give them an issue as far as causing some damage to the other branches. So you know, if you're going to be taking anything off, you need to try and get it down toward the base. As far as the seed heads and the flowering tips, that's just an aesthetic thing. If you want to do it, fine. If you don't, I know I don't do mine because it'd take me forever, and it's kind of a pain. But I don't do it on mine. But you know, again, that's a personal preference. What I wouldn't want you to do is to take it back any further than that seed tip or that flower tip, because that's going to help. That's not going to help the tree very much at all.
Thank you, Pat.
This is that perfect example of what you look at when you have an issue with a 3-cut method. And what you had is here, somebody started to do this cut up here, and they didn't do that undercut, that first cut that you do to prevent the peeling. And as the branch fell away from the tree, it pulled all this bark down. So, I mean, it came off well, and he started probably pretty close to the bark ridge, which was good, but you know, he didn't do that first cut, and it just caused all sorts of issues. So there's your 3-cut method issue. If you guys have got smaller trees, this is one of your biggest things, I think, is weed eater damage. And about the only thing you can do there is try and protect it and cover it up a little bit, put something around there to prevent further damage. But there's really not much you can do once it's been damaged like that. That you just have to let the tree try and grow out of it itself. Oops, I'm missing a list. I'm missing one. Anyhow, let's see if I can find that. Well, I guess I'll have to pass it up. I had another one here that it had my tree versus my neighbor's tree, and it had to do with the raising the canopy raising. And my tree has a lot less. Matter of fact, I think I got a picture of my tree back in here somewhere. I'm very proud of my tree, by the way, one of my trees. That's my tree. And this, I'm going to shed on this one because, you know, if I was going up 33%, I'd probably be up about here. And I really don't think that's going to make that tree look any better. And so I've tried to stay away from that. This also shows you where you have clearance on mine is over probably about 8 or 10 foot there. And there's my 14-foot area that I have to be cleared for the street. But that's a 30-year-old tree, and it's done very, very well. My next door neighbor's got one that started before this one, and it looks like it's a scarecrow because when they did the crown raising, they came up way up high and they stripped a bunch of the growth and the leaf structure away from a lot of the limbs, and it really looks like a scarecrow almost. So just something to keep in mind when you're having to do it. Mine was done by an arborist. His was done by a tree service. So I attribute that to some of the reasons why he had his problem. He comes over and looks at mine and says, "Oh boy, I sure wish hadn't done that." But anyhow, back to the end. I'm done. Unless there's other questions, is there anything else I can?
Yes, Pat, we have a couple of questions. One of them goes back to what you said to the neighbors about removing mulch. I think that's a very important one, and it came up a couple of times. Again, it's a relatively new neighborhood put in by a variety of different builders. Most of the trees in our neighborhood were incorrectly planted, so they're too deep. Yeah. And they've got volcano mulches right up against the bark. And since the homeowners moved in with that appearance, they continue to add more bark and are just raising those volcano mulches up against the bark. So can you address the mulch and what to do if the tree's planted too deeply, if there's anything? And also, when should they be removing the stakes that have been put in?
Okay, all good questions. The volcano mulch, there, as a matter of fact, Kim, have you seen the one that they did a pamphlet, or not a pamphlet, but a little handout? I'll need to get that to you. You can share that with the rest of the organization, but it goes into the companion mulch. We've had this issue with a bunch of different groups, including homeowners associations, including towns. Town of Flower Mound to me is got some issues. They don't really volcano mulch as much as they don't expose the root flare. So it is an issue. It does promote diseases and bugs and everything else, and so it shouldn't be done. You shouldn't have more than 2 to 3 inches of mulch around the diameter of the tree. That's always a big no-no. But do you need? I'll get Liz to get you that. How about that volcano?
Okay.
Kathy Rainey is the one that brought that up, and she's been working with the homeowners association. So we basically made her a fact sheet that goes into how that's supposed to be done, and I think it's helped out a lot from her group anyway. So
Okay,
let
well,
me
Pat,
do that for you.
Pat,
So
thank you, because we actually could use that. We have a little library here, and we could
Okay.
put that in the little library, so all the residents, even those that aren't attending today, could have
Okay.
access. So yeah, if you could get even just a master copy to me, then I'm sure
Oh,
Tori
yeah.
could have that printed for us.
Okay. What was the other ones? I can't remember.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
when should it, if the builders have staked a tree, some of those trees are starting to grow around the stakes, the part that's holding the stakes in place. When should they be removing the stakes in general?
As soon as they can. I mean, the stakes are only there to allow the tree to get some root growth and some lateral root growth in order to stabilize it. You really don't want them on there, because what happens is that if you look at the root flare is where the area where the pivot point is going to be for the tree. And if you put the guides on and stuff like that, it will prevent that from developing the strength it needs to be able to stand up to a wind. So the only time you stake it, as a matter of fact, we don't even recommend you staking it when you're planting a new tree, unless it's actually necessary. It's just kind of an issue with, over time, people forget to take them off, and it weakens the trees basically. So it's not something you really want to do for a long-term process. You all mentioned about the height of the trees, and you said yours are built probably set too low. That's
Yeah,
usually not what I see. I usually see them all. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think what most of the people that are doing when they're putting these things in quickly is they're digging the holes too deep and then just plopping the trees in. And so there's not a root flare on. I'd say the majority of trees in our neighborhood don't have a good root flare.
That could be an issue. Typically, you don't want you want to have it so that when that root ball goes into the ground, that ball is sitting either even with or just a little bit of proud to the sides of the tree, and that allows the tree to be able to settle a little bit and to grow out without having to adjust its root flare conditions. And so it's not a good thing. It's hard to go do, because basically you're going to have to take that tree out, and if they did that, then they also may not have flared the roots very well either too. So it may be something that's, if the tree's small enough and it hasn't been in there long enough, it might be something you could consider doing, but it's really not the easy thing to go do.
Well, what I'm recommending to the neighbors is they get it down as close as they can,
Yeah.
and get it away from the trunk as best as they can to
Oh, yeah.
reduce the risk of all that fungal growth and that softening of the bark that happens.
Yeah, and also,
but we have a couple of neighbors that have been asking you questions about putting in new trees. So that's something they can definitely watch, because some of the trees have died. When they order a new tree, they can absolutely watch and ask people to make sure
absolutely,
that
yeah, because you want to make sure there's a lot of, and there's a really good cheat sheet, if you will, that's on the website, or it's on DCMGA website about tree planting, and I think it's a really good one to follow. There's some funny things out there that I don't want to promote Howard Garrett, but he was doing okay. I always read his, because I always figure it's a good place to start as far as learning what people are seeing. And one of the things that he was talking about was he went through about 3 different series of tree plantings. He had 3 different articles, and one of them was where you dug the hole and then you sprayed the sides with hydrogen peroxide or bleach or something. You just drove me nuts anyway. But so there are some different things out there, but if you follow the Aggie thing and the promotions there, I think it'd be fine. The other thing that happens when you have a buildup of the area around the roots is you have what you call adventitious roots, where it starts trying to develop roots out the sides of the trunk, and it's not healthy for the tree, and it just again adds to more of the issues you have later on.
Thank you, Pat, for those tips. We also had a homeowner. We are required, again, I think I mentioned this earlier, by our CCRs to have trees in that parkway, or what some people call the health strip. We're required to have that. It's a narrow space, as you know. The neighbors want to know if there's any good tree for that health strip space that won't later damage sidewalks or streets.
The real short answer is probably no, but the reality is that there's some of the smaller trees you might want to think about is, the problem with the smaller tree is the smaller tree is going to have a canopy that may reach out. And, so, I like Mexican plums. I like red buds. I like some of the other smaller trees that are out there. And just something where you can have especially a flowering tree. I think people like the flowering trees, and both of those are that. But the problem you're going to run into with that is, I don't know how wide your strip is, but it may be too close to them to be able to interfere with people walking down or cars driving down. So it's kind of a mixed drag. You can get some of the smaller. I'm trying to think. There's I think it's overused, but there's a lace bark elm that can be managed at that level.
We have a lot of lace bark in our park space.
Yeah,
so
that's an overused tree right now.
It is an overused tree.
So,
but it is relatively easy. Real quick, because I know we're running out of time. We have a homeowner that wants to know if they've hired somebody to plant a tree and it shows up with co-dominant branches. Would you recommend them sending it back and asking for one that only has one main leader?
If you can, yeah, I do that. I mean, the other thing I do is, if I had somebody coming in with a tree that was going to be planted, I make them take it out of the container to see what the conditions of the roots were, because you really don't want any girdling roots. And that's typically something that happens with something that comes from a nursery, is that there's a lot of girdling, and you can account for that and can compensate for it. But if you don't have to have either one of them, you'd be better off not having either one of them.
Absolutely. My son recently had a tree planted, and he got to pick the one out from the nursery, and he kept sending me pictures all day. And I tell him to take the pot off. They will. They'll remove it from the pot so you can look at the roots. One more question, and then I think we've got two more questions real quick. One, a neighbor thinks that they may have elm scorch on their tree. Is there anything that can or should be done about scorched leaves on the elm tree leaves?
Do you know what type of elm it is?
Probably in this neighborhood, lace bark or cedar elm.
I've never really seen it too much on them. I don't know. That's kind of I'd have to go look at it. I don't really know of anything that causes that type of an issue. The elm trees that right now should be starting to shedding their leaves anyway. I mean, they are one of the first trees. Cedar elms, lace bark elms, all the elms are one of the first trees that lose their leaves, and so they're going to look like they're yellowing and getting scorched or something like that. And it may or may not be true. It may be just the natural growth of the tree.
Thank you, Pat. And then the very last question, I know you don't have very much time, but do you have any quick general tips for digging up and replanting shrubs? What's the best time of year, and what's the best method to do that?
The dormant time is when you want to do that. If it's a smaller shrub, you shouldn't have too much of a problem with it. If it's a larger shrub, I've heard that some folks come back in early in the year and will actually sever some of the larger roots in order to make that transition easier, because it lets the bush adapt to it a little bit, so that when you go to move it, it won't have as much root strength structure on it, but it'll also be adjusted to having that less root structure in order to support it. But during the falls, when you do it, or during summer, that goes back winter, in the winter, early spring, and when the tree is dormant, when the bush is dormant. Again, going back to what you were talking, it just made me think about something also. All of the things I told you relative to removal of branches and things like that apply to shrubs too. So when you're doing a shrub thing, you don't want to, if you can, you don't want to use a tip pruning method. You want to use a root or a limb pruning method as opposed to the tip pruning. Tip pruning just generates growth, and it doesn't really help the tree too much. It also causes shady areas that causes stuff to die back. So just an idea.
Pat, thank you very much. I'm going to turn this back over to Tori, but before I do, I just want to reach out to all the neighbors that are listening and remind them that they can either, if all of their questions didn't get answered, that we're always available 24/7 at the help desk for you to submit your questions. And then Usually within 24 to 48 hours, your questions are answered. But also, since I live in the neighborhood, any of you can reach out directly to me. I walk by people's homes, and even with COVID, I can safely walk up. I won't touch your trees, I won't touch your shrubs, but I will take a look at them. If you ever do have a question of me or someone at the help desk, pictures help, because some things, like you, if you're saying the term elm scorch, we might not know what that means to you, but a picture helps us to do a field diagnosis. None of us are qualified to do a scientific diagnosis. That has to go through like a certified arborist or a lab, but we can give you advice. Pat,
Yep.
you have been fantastic.
Well, thank you.
Those neighbors that came in after I talked about you earlier, I just want to say very quickly, Pat has taught me more about trees than I ever thought I needed to know. And now I'm ashamed that it took me into my 50s before I did know, because my trees are much healthier now than in any other place I've ever lived, because of the advice that I've mostly learned directly from Pat Moyer. So thank you so much for taking the time out of your day
Don't
to
get
be
too,
here.
but don't get too afield.
You
It's
deserve.
a fun project. It's a fun system, and if you, like I said, if you need anything specific, let me know. I can definitely help you out too if I can.
Thank you.
Great little loop. All righty. Well, thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Pat. One more thing before everyone logs off. We did get a couple concerns about those trees that are right there in that little strip. I know a couple of you guys have some dying trees right there. We are working with the board to see if we can try and change that CCNR to not require that tree. Again, I know you guys were expressing that, it's a really tough tree, just, root wise and growing wise. So we are working on with the board to try and see if we can change that CCNR. So just so everyone is aware, it is on our radar, and we are doing our best to try and get that CCNR changed. So
I was just at a group out in Highland Village that did the same thing. They had the same restrictions, and it's really that those trees just aren't going to thrive. They're not going to do well.
Yeah. So thank you again, Pat. Thank you again, Kim and David. And then right before everybody leaves, I think I got everybody. There's one more person on who was participating this morning that I do not have information for. So Sherry D, if you wouldn't mind shooting me a message privately in the chat box, just with your first and last name and your address, so I can send out a gift to all of you guys that participated. So thank you all so much again. Thank you, Pat. Thank you, Kim and David, for taking the time to do this for us. So we really appreciate you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.